one of the things that I think is cruel about this lawsuit is that they're saying that it's illegal for the United States to treat Native children differently than other children now that Congress has done something that's actually remedial around structural racism. And it's like, you all have been treating Native children differently since the beginning of the Republic. You know, Native children have been prisoners of war. They've been rounded up at gunpoint. They've been, you know, it's like our children have been through a lot. And I think that because it is such an effective tool, you see generations of Native children being used really as a tip of the spear in the project of genocide and assimilation. And so I think, you know, one of the moments of history that we are talking about a lot now after unmarked graves were discovered in Canada, is boarding schools. So starting in the late 1800s, the United States and then later federal government ran schools, and then later a bunch of churches opened hundreds more. And the thinking was that if you took Native children and you separated them from their family and their tribe and really stripped them of their Native identity, that they wouldn't be Native anymore. And that if you did that to enough Native children over enough generations, eventually there wouldn't be Native people anymore. And so that was really the goal of those schools. And we also know from both federal documents and also from the stories of survivors that they were horrific places to be a child. You know, Carlisle, which was the first school to open and was run by the military, didn't have enough money to provide the kids with food and medical care, you know, would rent them out as farm labor during the summer to help fund the school. And so, and I think what's important about the boarding school era is that it's kind of the beginning, and it really marks this transition. You were talking about how we think about genocide as being about physical violence, like murder and death. And there's this transition where the US government kind of figures out, okay, these wars are extremely expensive. And, you know, often because Native people were better at combat. And so there's this new project to assimilate Native people and to use these policies like boarding schools, like adoption, like urban relocation, so that if we separate Native people from their tribe and their culture, eventually, you know, we can, you know, quote unquote, get rid of the Indian problem. And the second generation of that was the Indian Adoption Project. And so before the Indian Child Welfare Act, which we'll get to, I'm sure in a minute, before the Indian Child Welfare Act, or ICWA, was passed, there was a big survey done and in the late 60s, and they found that 25 to 35% of all Native children had been removed from their families and tribes. And there were a couple of things going on. So the federal government, the BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, was running this thing called the Indian Adoption Project, where they were partnering with the Child Welfare League of America to adopt Native kids out and purposely place them with white families, with this really racist thinking that those children would be better off in those families. But the other thing that was happening was that there was a lot of racism and bias within state child welfare systems. And so social workers would see a Native kid that was, you know, maybe being raised by their grandma or being raised by another extended family member, which is very, very common in our communities, and say, oh, well, that's abandonment because their biological parents aren't with them. That's abandonment. And they would come and they would take those kids. And I would say the third generation of that, which I think we're like just beginning to talk about, is present day foster care. And so there's some pretty shocking statistics that I found while I was researching this podcast. And since ICWA has been passed, the number of Native kids in foster care and the number of Native kids who are being adopted has gone up, not down. And so, you know, like you can look at states like Minnesota, and in Minnesota, Native children have a 1 in 3 chance of entering foster care before they turn 18. Native babies have a 1% chance of entering foster care before their first birthday. Like, imagine being that parent. You know, imagine being that parent and having those odds. It's at 5 or 6, I can't think of it off the top of my head, but in 5 or 6 states, Native kids have a 50% chance of being investigated or reported to CPS. In Alaska, it's 80%. And so you still see the systemic removal. And it's a lot like what was happening in the 60s, where people are equating poverty with neglect, and kids are being removed from their parents based on neglect.